Welcome to another Dragonlance Saga Dungeon Mastering 101 episode. It is Palast New Cult the 12th. My name is Adam, and today I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to continue my, I should just read my script. I'm continuing my Dragonlance gaming series all about dungeon mastering. Most new dungeon masters think it's a good idea, think that good sessions come down to one thing, and that's combat. But if every session is only a fight, then players can get burned out on it. If there's no tension, the world feels flat. And if characters don't grow, the story doesn't stick. Running a great game isn't about doing one thing well, it's about balancing multiple forms of engagement. And today, we're breaking down the 5 pillars of running a table and how understanding them can help transform the way that you run your game. Now, my stumbling through my opening script beside, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel, ring the bell, and you can always support the channel by becoming a patron on Patreon or a member of the YouTube channel. And of course, you can pick up Dragonlance Media or $10 by signing up to startplaying.games using my affiliate links in the description below. So I already talked a little bit about, really briefly, about the 5 pillars of running a good table. But ultimately, it's something that needs a little bit more development. And as I'm building out this sort of instructional, course, I guess you might refer to it, I want to dive deeper into it. So I had originally presented the core fundamentals as a broad view synopsis. And within that are a series of individual episodes. Last week's was one of them. And today we're going to be talking about this. So the table is ultimately a system. It's not an individual scene. And we have to think of that as dungeon masters sometimes and remind ourselves, because we tend to go from scene to scene to scene when really the connective tissue between those can be more engaging than the individual scenes or encounters themselves. So before we talk about the pillars themselves, we need to reset expectations a little bit. A Dungeons & Dragons session is not a sequence of encounters. It is a dynamic system made up of player motivations, emotional energy, pacing, and choices and consequences. All of those together are what create an engaging table. So the 5 pillars, they're not rigid categories. They're sort of lenses that you can view the game through. They help you diagnose what a session needs right now, and it creates a balanced table, which ultimately feels alive because it shifts focus naturally from one pillar to the next. So when we're talking about pillars, we're talking about aspects of the game, essentially, okay? So pillar 1 is combat, tension, and stakes. So combat's not just about tactics and damage. At its best, combat provides urgency, it provides risk, visible consequences, and cinematic payoff. Now, for new DMs, combat should answer the following question: what happens if the players fail? Because they can. And if you don't let the players fail, then no combat encounter is going to feel meaningful. So that doesn't mean they have to die. It doesn't have to end in a TPK, but it also doesn't have to end in the exact same way that every encounter would end if they had one, meaning the players walk away without fuss or muss. Ultimately, the bad guys, whomever they may be if combat is occurring, aren't going to just let the players walk away if they're defeated, right? They're probably going to capture them. They're probably going to interrogate them. They're probably going to try to find out exactly what the hell they're doing in their territory. And then think of it in more of a macro scale. Who are the faction that these combatants are connected to? And if the heroes fail and the combatants win, how does that upset the balance of factions in your game? So another way of looking at this is short, meaningful fights are infinitely better than long, repetitive ones. One thing that I gleaned that I found interesting in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition was that they said no encounter should last longer than 3 rounds. And initially I was like, oh, well, that's ridiculous. Like, what can you actually do in 3 rounds? But when you actually think about the amount of people at your table, 3 rounds can be a very long time, especially in like 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons rule sets, where everyone has a action, a movement, a bonus action, and a reaction. And most of the bonus actions and reactions all have some form of a combat component to them. So it could take a very long time for one player to go through their turn in a round, let alone however many players you have at the table. I often run with 4 to 6 players on a regular basis. So it can take a significant amount of time. So if you just think about, player A having to wait for B, C, D, and so on to go, and then all the monsters to go, and then they get another chance to do their thing, that can actually be pretty taxing and boring, ultimately, for the players. And understandably so. And especially if they just happen to not really be able to do anything fundamentally effective in the combat. Then they just have to kind of sit there and twiddle their thumbs, and that sucks. So the idea of maintaining shorter form encounters when they have to be combat actually is really simple. Think of it this way. If you're the enemy and I'm the hero and I'm beating up on you, are you going to fight to the death? Or at some point, are you going to realize that you're outmatched and you're going to try to run, or you're going to try to give up, or you're going to try to barter your way out of the situation? Not everything has to end in death when it comes to combat. Sometimes you can just stop combat and just talk, and that will do enough. And sometimes you end combat in just that way. By defeating the opponents, they surrender, and then you can have a conversation with them that maybe they weren't so inclined to have before you kicked their ass, right? So if after one round, a combatant of some intelligence, they can probably figure out whether or not the side, the strength is pitched on one side or the other of an encounter. If they're animalistic and they're unintelligent, or undead, well, maybe they're not going to figure that out, and that's fine. But think about your combat encounters in terms of survivability. No one wants to die. Everyone is trying to live. And if that means giving up to fight another day, then that's a pretty good choice to make, right? So always keep that in your back pocket as well. You don't have to have every combat go until everyone's dead. That can take a long time. Think after 3 rounds, if it's not done yet, and if there's still, a pitched battle of one side decimating the other, well, then perhaps that other side that's getting decimated should give up. It's an option. And it'll shorten your encounters infinitely faster, and it'll bring a sense of accomplishment to the players more than just pounding people into the ground with a mallet. So also keep this in mind. Every combat should matter narratively or emotionally. You're not in an arena throwing wave after wave of monsters against PCs to grind experience. The sole purpose of combat encounters is that there's some form of an obstacle that these creatures are on one side of that you're trying to get to the other side of, but they're preventing you from doing that. So it has to fit into a larger narrative. Yes, you're going to have random encounters from time to time, but random encounters should only exist to break up otherwise monotonous overland adventuring. It shouldn't be solely to exist just to throw XP at players. And even then, again, most campaign settings have it set up where in this type of terrain, you will have these types of monsters that live there. You're not going to have just random, out of context monsters walking through random terrains. These are areas where people live. Monsters and creatures, animals exist in the world, right? Perpetually. So you might wander across a hive or a den or someone's actual home or declared territory. And that's where the random monster encounter occurs. And that's why they're there. So always think in terms of justifying why this exists and use that as the sort of jumping off point. I've run into so many games. I used to play a lot of 3rd edition when it came out. And I was always that weirdo whenever an encounter occurs, I'm like, okay, well, why did that happen? Why were those monsters there? Like, we're literally on a hillside in the middle of nowhere. Why the hell were they there? We happened to be there because we're cutting across this area to try to get to this other area, but why were they there? And the DM was just like, don't worry about it. It's just an encounter. Let's just move on. And in my head, I'm like, that's so lazy. You can't even just come up with a simple reason. Like, oh no, they were trying to evade the road or stay away from the main road, or, they were hunting after someone that had killed one of their party members, or, they were like looking for a specific route to solve some sort of problem. Like, you couldn't come up with anything. It was just like, oh no, it's a random monster. Don't worry about it. It's lazy. There's always a reason people exist in areas. So always, even if it's a simple throwaway reason, it doesn't have to be detailed. You don't have to build a backstory for a random encounter, but there should be a reason it's there. All right, so context is important in combat. Combat is the pressure cooker of the game, so use it intentionally. Most players go into Dungeons and Dragons, and actually most game systems, wanting combat because that's how they're taught, just through the cultural zeitgeist of TTRPG hobbies, that's what the game is about. It's about combat, which I fundamentally disagree. That's one component of it. But ultimately, if they're expecting combat, you want to give them some combat so that they have some fun. But you don't want it to be meaningless. You want it to have some sort of core purpose other than just for combat's purpose itself. All right, so that was pillar 1. Combat. Pillar 2 is exploration, curiosity, and discovery. So exploration is about giving players the freedom to investigate the world. And this includes physical travel, dungeons, wilderness, mysteries, and environmental storytelling. So exploration works best when choices lead to different outcomes, meaning your choices have an effect on the environment. Information is earned, not just handed out by the dungeon master. And the world ultimately reacts to curiosity. Now, the choices lead to different outcomes is very, very simple. Don't railroad your players. Let them make choices. If they don't want to go into the dungeon that you took all day preparing, that's fine. You can actually extrapolate on the fly some other random encounters from a different direction they want to go to and spin that into the next narrative just through improv. That's what good dungeon masters are capable of. And that means that their choice of not going into the dungeon did not blow up and ruin your game. It just changed the trajectory momentarily of your game, because you could always have whatever choice they made lead right back to the dungeon in some other way. Just be creative with it. And then, of course, information being earned. You should never, ever, ever, and I've done this. I've done this way more than I should have. You should never have there be just one way for people to get information in a game. Because ultimately what happens is they don't get it the way that you want them to. And so they either don't get the information, or you just ham-fist give it to them out of frustration that they're not going to continue down this path that you had set out for them, which you should never have done in the first place. There should be multiple ways for people to learn the same type of information. And if everything else fails, you can always fall back on perception and insight in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And if you're in 1st edition, just roll a wisdom check or an intelligence check and help them along a little bit. Because as a dungeon master, you know everything intimately. So what you think should be obvious is not always obvious to the players. Maybe you didn't tease them enough with the information, or how to garner the information, or the different ways they might learn it. Maybe they're just unfamiliar with the campaign milieu, and you need to present them with some actual in-character information so they understand what it is they're trying to discover. And that will then help them discover, a little bit further. So I always sort of break it down in the roles of characters. Would a martial style character who spent their entire life training and exercising and doing everything they can to be the best physically fit specimen of war know this information? If not, then they're probably not going to know it, and I'm not going to try to lead them along the path of learning it. If someone who spent their whole life studying arcane books If they would know the information, well then perhaps I would ask them to give me a wisdom check or an intelligence check to see if in their studies they ran across something similar or something germane to the information. If it's priests who spent their entire lives devoted to studying the philosophy and religion that they adhere to, in their studies, have they run across any bit of information that might be germane to what it is you're trying to feed them? Then roll a wisdom check or roll an intelligence check. Just because the player doesn't know it doesn't mean you should ham-fist give it to them, and it definitely doesn't mean that they can't figure it out. You just have to be a little bit more creative as a dungeon master and hope that the players are a little bit creative in the way that they're exploring the information that you're trying to get to them. And then, have them stumble across a sage or someone who's worked in a library or someone who has some sort of background with the information that you're trying to share. Always have more than one way, because otherwise, like I've experienced so many times, you're going to have to just give them the information because you were too obscure with your efforts. And there's nothing more bad feeling for a player than just being handed information. That's lazy as hell. Okay, and then ultimately the world reacts to curiosity. Not everything is black and white, right? So going up to a group of individuals standing around doesn't always lead to combat. Sometimes it leads to learning new information. Always lean on stereotypes of a given area and lean on just initial impressions that one type of person would give another type of person. Because as much as sometimes we don't want to admit it, every single human being is naturally biased. It is part of what has built us up to be survivable in our lizard brains and in our ancient histories. We have to make quick, rash judgments about someone or something without knowing anything about them other than their physical appearance in some cases. And so as much as you may not cognitively like that idea in a modern society, certainly in the context of a game, humans are probably going to be a little bit more inclined to talk to another human. Dwarves are probably more inclined to talk to another dwarf, and fighters are more likely to talk to another fighter over a wizard, for example. So use these innate biases that every single human being has in snap judgments to then react to the players through their curiosity and have them actively influence the world that way. So ultimately for new DMs, know this. You do not need maps for everything. And it's going to save you a ton of time, and it's going to save you a bunch of headache by not mapping everything out, because it's just not important in most cases. First of all, most players don't want maps. They just want to know what's this diagram of where we're going to be having a combat, if we're going to have combat, or if there's some sort of tactical reason to know, or you can just on the fly describe it to them like we used to do, theater of the mind style. Hey, Ryan, how you doing, man? And then ultimately, make sure you're giving players meaningful options, not exhaustive detail. Players will fill in detail in their own mind from their own experience, from everything, and from their previous games. So you just need to paint a distinct picture, not necessarily a crystal clear picture, right? They'll fill in the rest just with their questions or with the way they engage with the scene or situation. Ultimately, exploration should feed player agency. It should excite them because they're learning something new about the campaign world that you're playing in, the milieu. And their characters are actually experiencing things. What I like to do is reward players with XP through exploration and the use of their curiosity and role-playing. That way it actually incentivizes them. They know, oh, I'm not just going to get XP for killing goblins. Well, then if everything I'm going to be able to do is going to get me XP, then I want to be a little bit creative with this, you know? At least that's what I've experienced in my past. You let me know in your personal experience here. All right, the third pillar here is social interaction, connections, and influence. So social interaction is where players test who their characters are. And these pillars include role-playing, negotiation, deception, persuasion, alliances, and rivalries. It is really, really important to give the opportunity of players to role play or to negotiate or somehow engage as if they are their character with the greater world at large, whether it's NPCs or the environment. If you give them the opportunity, then they probably will take it and they'll probably run with it for a little while. That doesn't necessarily have to be like an hour-long experience, but it certainly does add context and texture to an otherwise combat-heavy or skill-based game if you're just letting them sort of riff a little bit for a little while. So some key points for Dungeon Masters to keep in mind when it comes to social interaction, connections, and influence. NPCs should have goals, not scripts. You as the Dungeon Master innately know what that NPC is there for. You don't need to know every single thought and monologue they may deliver, and you may stumble through it as you're trying to do an accent or whatever. That's okay. Players are generally pretty forgiving as long as you are trying, and there's actually a world behind, there's a mind behind the NPCs. So they're not just cardboard cutouts sitting in front of the players that the players are talking to, and they're not getting responses back that make sense. So again, just like player choices and agency, everything needs context and everything needs to have some sort of reason for existing. NPCs traditionally are just people living their lives. They have a job to do, and they are usually doing the job when they encounter the PCs. So if they're a guard, they may not be excited or even love their job, but they're certainly doing it for a reason. And usually it has to involve with money. You know, they need to make a living somehow. Farmers are going to farm. Ranchers are going to ranch. Boatmen are going to ferry. I don't know what that... Yes, that sounds right. I don't know. And so if every NPC has a job, just like the players have a job of adventuring to make money, then how is that going to inform how they engage with the players? You know what I mean? And then are they going to have different mannerisms based on the job they have? There's always that stereotype of sailors and stereotypes of their language and mannerisms, certainly with pirates. What would be some stereotypes with some lawmen or with some tavern owners or, blacksmiths? So just add a little bit of color to make every NPC feel a little bit different. Again, you don't have to have full monologues or backstories or anything like that. One or two details is usually enough to differentiate between NPCs for players. Let conversations change the world, meaning information is gleaned from them that will influence choices made by the player characters. And then ultimately, you need to remember to reward engagement, not just high rolls. Engagement may be off-the-cuff conversations, but it also may require some rolls. So don't just have it be, okay, you rolled a 17, here is all the information. Bleh. Have the NPC deliver the information in the way the NPC would. It may take a little bit longer. It may try patience. But ultimately, you're adding in-depth texture to the world rather than just spitting out information to the players. Just ran your first session in 25 years. Players are on their way to Taladas. That's awesome. Congratulations. That's a hell of an achievement after 25 years diving into Taladas. So always keep in mind that social scenes turn the world from backdrop into relationships. And the players should have a relationship with the world that they're in because it's what they're fighting for, right? Either on behalf of their home, or someone's paid them and hired them to go do something, or they want to rid the world of evil for some reason. Like there's a connection that people have to the land itself for some reason. Find out what that is and use that to help in motivation. All right, so the fourth pillar of the 5 pillars is downtime, reflection, and growth. This is something that I do not enjoy doing on live streams. It's actually pretty annoying in a lot of cases, but you have to deal with it in some way. Because ultimately downtime does not mean a shopping spree. Like that's something that's just, I will never at a table go through and role play a shopping experience. If it's like a single encounter, I'll do it. But if they're like going through a huge list, we're going to do that shit off table. We are not going to do it during the time that we have to play the game. There's so much more important stuff to do than that. But downtime can also mean taking your short and long breaks in the context of a 5th edition, which doesn't take a lot of time to go through, but it is something where players are doing it just so they can get powers back or rememorize new spells or something like that. But you as a dungeon master should use it as a means of helping the players digest what they just experienced earlier in the game through context, right? If there's an NPC with the party, how does the NPC engage with the players during this downtime? What are the NPC's goals and how are the players helping or hindering those? Have a conversation about them. Like there's so much to do in downtime that's outside of just sitting around and staring at your player character or clicking buttons in D&D Beyond or, I mean, engage with the players during this time as well. So downtime is often overlooked, and that is a huge mistake. Downtime allows characters to reflect on what they've gone through. It allows players to breathe between stressful situations and encounters. It allows consequences to settle on the characters' minds. If they did something brash, well, now they get to think about it. Like, oh, shoot, I didn't intend that to happen by my actions. Now that I realize those were the consequences of my choices, I need to figure out a way out of this, or I'm going to double down on it, or, it gives them a chance to really reflect on the choices made. And then ultimately, remember that the world itself, during their downtime, is still moving. The world doesn't stop when the players do. If the players were running away from people and they go for a downtime break, those people are still running after the players. They don't stop simply because the players stopped. The players wanted a short rest or a long rest. The bad guys were hunting the players, so they're going to continue. So always keep that in mind. And a really great way of ramping up tension, as long as you don't overuse it, is to interrupt downtime. Players hate it, but it adds a sense of anxiety and pressure that they're supposed to go do something. If they're standing around too long and not progressing with what it is they're trying to do, it's your job to push them a little bit. Just a little bit of a push will go a long way. All right, so for DMs, always keep this in mind. Downtime doesn't need weeks of in-game time. You can resolve it like that. Time can pass as quickly or as slowly as you let it. A single evening, a festival, or a travel montage can count as downtime. Using downtime to highlight character priorities is a great method of leveraging downtime. Remind them what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, or just ask them. So now that you got a moment to think, what is it you're going after again? And so you're just refreshing their memory, refocusing them, because it's easy to get distracted, especially if you're throwing random encounters, you have planned encounters, the world is reacting around them, they just got an info dump that may or may not be relevant at all. So players' heads can start spinning. So it's really important for you as the DM to narrow their focus and put them back on track if there is in fact a direction that they're supposed to be moving in. And so just remember that without downtime, ultimately the game can be exhausting. We want to make sure the players have a fairly decent sense of pacing, and they're only stressed out when they're supposed to be, and otherwise they're able to think and digest what you're throwing at them. All right, and so the last pillar that I think is important for gaming is character arcs. Meaningful and investing character arcs. If you have a character at level 1 who by the time you hit level 2 has not changed in any way, I think you, the player, and you, the DM, are not doing a good job. There should be something that stresses them, that forces them to reevaluate the world that they live in, because they have just started their career. They don't know shit about shit at all. Think of yourself when you got out of high school. Did you think you had the world figured out? Yeah, of course you did. But when you started getting out into the world, you realized, oh, this is not exactly what I thought it was going to be like, or maybe I should. Everyone goes through growth. Everyone learns through experience and failure. Player characters should be the same way. They should not act exactly the same as they did at first level when they reach 5th level or 10th level. They should have growth through their experiences, and they should reflect that growth in their demeanor, in the way they approach the world. They're certainly learning how to deal with conflict in the form of monsters, encounters with NPCs, and the world itself. So their behaviors should adjust accordingly. Now, that doesn't mean they go from being a chaotic good character to a chaotic evil character. They could still be the same alignment and have the same general outlook, but they're definitely going to have experienced change. One thing you can always lean on is the hero's journey, and help characters sort of talk about what they've gone through at some point. And maybe you use leveling up as a time to do this, or maybe just after every few sessions you touch in with a different player. But just talk to them about their characters briefly. Like, okay, so how's your character feeling about everything that's going on? You know, you started right here with this mindset. You've experienced all this other stuff. How does that influence your character? And give them an opportunity to consider those choices. Because again, as adults, it's hard for us to get time to play this game. So a lot of cases, you can go weeks or even months before you sit down at the table again. And you may not remember everything as a player that's happened. And that's totally normal and okay, because this is a game. It is not your priority. Your priority is your life and your family or whatever. So it's incumbent upon the dungeon master to sort of lean into this from time to time and just be like, hey, I just wanted to check in with your character. You know, you're a paladin. You came up with this, sort of a history of worship, and you went through all these experiences early on in your adventuring career. Now you've been challenged with these other mindsets or these other characters or NPCs or PCs that you've had to deal with, and you've had to sort of make choices along the way that maybe weren't the best for what you would have done at first level. How does that impact your character moving forward? Do they still feel the same about their religion, about their party, about the world? Because we often tend, and again, this is my own personal experience, but I've raised 2 kids and I sort of see a pattern here where we sort of have a black and white view of the world until we experience the world. And then we quickly realize that the world is not black and white at all. It's at best shades of gray. And we sort of have to make our way through that through some difficult choices or difficult situations that the world will throw at us. The world is pure chaos, and we're just trying to work through that chaos, hopefully connecting with people along the way and having meaningful relationships and growing as individuals. That's the goal, right? Your players should be the same. Not as impactful and important, but in the context of the game world, it should be. So consider it. So character arcs are the emotional backbone of the campaign, and they're going to answer, why does the character care? Why are they doing what they're doing? What is it that they want? And what challenges them personally? And for dungeon masters, you need to understand that you don't need full backstory novels from players, and you should not be developing them for players. Throughout the course of the game, that is where you sort of clue in and add in little notes of background information that connects them to the world, it connects them to the campaign you're running, and it makes it infinitely easier for you to just make something up on the fly when it's convenient, rather than trying to filter through the 82 pages of backstory that the player put together for you to see how you can fit them into your campaign. Don't stress it. Take your time. When something comes up, just be like, oh, you've heard this NPC's name before. Your father used to talk about him, and he was a scoundrel. And now the player gets to riff a little bit. Oh, yeah, maybe he doubled... crossed my father on a deal when they were transporting goods across to No Star or something. And then you're like, yeah, exactly right. And now he's come back and he's looking to screw over some other people. And you clearly have a sort of lead in on what he's going to do. So how would you approach the situation? Or do NPCs change as well? He used to be a bad guy, now he's a good guy. You're approaching him with how you knew him, not necessarily how he is now. Maybe he's turned a new leaf, and you have to have that experience, back and forth conversation, in order to learn that. But your backstory informs those types of decisions, and they can be made on the fly. So look for unresolved questions in your backstory, and this will continually develop because you only should have a very loose idea of what your backstory is, and that should then be developed further with the DM through the game. And Dungeon Masters, you don't have to keep track of every little note that the character has gone through, but you should have some general ideas about what they've done. And if you need to, ask to look at their notes. Unless they're like drawing pictures that are not flattering of you or writing down comments that are terrible about you, they shouldn't really care. And they should be taking notes. So you just sort of glance over their notes really quick to see what they find important. And then you can use that later on to influence them and their choices in the world. And then ultimately tying in character choices to world consequences is incredibly important. It just sinks them into the campaign even more. So when characters grow, ultimately players stay invested in the game. So that is the 5 pillars that I put together here. Now, balancing them, you don't need all 5 pillars in every session. Instead, try to rotate focus over multiple sessions, watch players' energy shift and move accordingly, and then use one pillar in order to support another. So again, those pillars are character arcs, downtime, social interaction, exploration, and combat. And then some examples of using different pillars at different times would be exploration leads to combat. That's the most sort of on the nose. Social interactions can create future conflicts, not necessarily combat. And then, of course, downtime sets up story arcs through reflection and understanding. Balance is about awareness. It's not about math. So always keep that in mind as a dungeon master. So this is sort of the mindset that shifts and ties everything together as the dungeon master. You are not delivering content. You are curating experiences. So the 5 pillars exist to serve player agency, emotional pacing, and shared storytelling. Your role as the dungeon master is to notice what the table needs and provide that right pillar at the right time. Just knowing instinctively based on how the players are acting at the table or how their characters are acting should cue you in to what you should do to help keep them engaged. So combat excites players, exploration invites them into the world, social interaction connects them to the world, and downtime sustains it all. Character arcs endure the campaign. So a great dungeon master doesn't master one pillar, they learn to balance all 5 of them. And once you understand these pillars, you stop asking what should happen next, and you start asking, what does this table need right now? And that is the heart of Dungeon Mastering 101. And that's going to do it for this episode of Core Foundations, the 5 pillars of running a table. Do you have any tips or tricks that you've experienced as a dungeon master or a player that you find germane to this discussion? I would encourage you to leave them in the comments, or if you ever join us online live, put them in the live chat. That's always helpful. But you can always feel free to email me at info@dlsaga.com as well. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, ring the bell to get notified about upcoming videos, and click the like button. You can also become a patron on Patreon or a member of this YouTube channel and even pick up DragonLance gaming materials using my affiliate links. All links are in the description below. Thank you to creator patron Aaron Hardy, developer patron Chris Androu, and Sam Ruiz, and producer patron Azrael. This channel is all about celebrating the wonderful world of the DragonLance Saga. Thank you so much for joining in that celebration. For DragonLance Saga, my name is Adam. Until next time, Slanjavar.